It was the wind that spoke first. A hollow, lonely sound scraping through the jagged remains of the once thriving colony and carrying the scent of ash and old blood. Garin stepped over a twisted beam of rusted metal, his boots grinding broken glass into the dirt. The sky overhead was choked with pale smoke, the sun a dull glow behind the haze. Bent doors, shattered windows, charred furniture, everything told a story of life interrupted by war. He was no stranger to such sights. He had walked over ruins in half a dozen settlements, each place bearing a similarity that made his stomach turn. Signs of a swift, brutal attack. This time, though, there was something else in the air, an unease that pricked at the back of his mind. He paused under the collapsed framework of a small building, scanning for movement. His rifle was at the ready, worn but well maintained. A faint flickering sense of familiarity haunted him. This place looked no different from the countless battlegrounds he had traversed, but still, he detected a presence. Normally he would turn and leave. Garin was not in the habit of lingering once he'd confirmed that a settlement was gone. He took no pleasure in rummaging through ashes. It only ever reminded him of what he had lost, of past failures he tried to bury. Yet something compelled him to continue. He found the first real sign of life near what might have been a market stall. A broken doll lay in the dirt, its cloth face half burned, staring up at the orange-gray sky. It made him pause longer than he should have. An image flashed through his mind of a child, wide-eyed, crying out in the middle of chaos. Shaking off the memory, Garin swallowed hard, shoulders tensing. He forced himself to move on. The ruins spread out in front of him like a graveyard. Some sections of the colony's infrastructure had been advanced once. He saw blackened solar panels, the scorched remains of what looked like a communications tower. Possibly people here had built their lives with optimism, forging homes even on a world overshadowed by conflict. Now, all that was left was smoke and echoes. A noise drifted to him. It was faint, a fragile sound he couldn't immediately identify. He paused, tilting his head, possibly a piece of sheet metal knocking in the wind or an animal rummaging among debris. But then it came again, a higher pitch, trembling. He realized it was a cry. A child's cry? His pulse jolted. Garin tightened his grip on the rifle. He wasn't sure if it was wise to investigate, but he also knew he couldn't just walk away. He found himself moving toward the sound, posture shifting into readiness, every sense on alert. The courtyard was covered in wreckage and thick haze. Fires still smoldered on the edges of collapsed structures. The stench of scorched earth, metal, and flesh pressed against him like a suffocating blanket. He stepped through a broken archway and spotted them. 3 figures in the midst of a swirl of dust and ash. A woman stood at the center, her body half turned to shield the 2 small children clutching at her leg. Around them was a circle of raiders, rough-looking men with tattered armor stained by both time and old blood. They were armed with rifles and crude melee weapons, and from the nasty smiles on their faces, they enjoyed the intimidation. Garin could see that the woman had no obvious weapon. She stood with her arms slightly spread, protecting the little ones, her long black hair messy with ash and sweat. Her skin had a silvery tint and streaks of dirt and dried blood crossed her cheeks. The children, 1 boy, 1 girl, peered from behind her, their eyes wide and terrified. Garin's breath caught. Raiders rarely left survivors, especially not children. What were they waiting for? He stepped carefully behind a broken wall, watching. One raider, a hulking brute, advanced on the woman, leveling a mocking grin. His voice carried low and cruel. "Pretty thing like you," he said, "out here all alone with 2 little ones to feed. Looks like your luck ran out." She said nothing, though Garin could see her trembling shoulders. Still, something in her stance wasn't purely fear. She seemed to be waiting, measuring the raider. The big man continued, "Maybe we take you with us, sell you off for a good price. Or maybe we just make you watch while we take what we want here, then leave you in the dirt." Another raider chuckled. One of them elbowed his comrade, whispering something Garin couldn't hear. The woman's face flickered. Then, with a voice that sounded steadier than her shaking limbs suggested, she spoke words that made Garen's gut twist. "My children are well behaved. I can be a good wife to you, human." There was no plea in her tone, only raw desperation and a cold, pragmatic calculation. She was stalling them, possibly hoping to negotiate for the children's lives. The men laughed, though one of them, a wiry raider, seemed taken aback by her directness. "She thinks she can choose," the brute sneered. He stepped closer and seized her wrist. She flinched but did not scream. Garen heard her suck in a breath. The bigger raider leaned in, about to yank her forward. Garen pulled the trigger. His rifle spat a single round and the raider's head snapped back. The brute dropped with a wet thud, dead before he knew what had happened. For a precious half-second, there was utter silence. Then the others whirled, cursing, reaching for their guns. Garen had already fired again. The second man went down with a shot clean through the chest. The next bullet missed, ricocheting off rubble. The surviving two raiders scattered, diving for cover behind twisted beams. "Stay down!" Garen shouted toward the woman, though he wasn't certain if she heard or even spoke his language. He advanced, sliding behind a chunk of destroyed vehicle chassis. Plasma blasts erupted, scorching the metal near his head. The acrid smell of superheated air assaulted his nose. He risked a glance around the edge of his cover, returning fire. One raider cried out, dropping his weapon as Garen's bullet tore through his shoulder. Another tried to flank him, pushing forward in a crouch. Suddenly the woman lunged across the courtyard. Garen saw her snag a discarded pistol from one of the dead raiders, her children huddled behind a half-collapsed barrier, eyes squeezed shut. The woman's hand shook, but she lifted the pistol and fired, the recoil jarring her entire body. She clipped a raider's thigh, drawing a furious snarl. He spun, leveling his rifle at her. Garen snarled and fired first, striking the raider in the side. The man collapsed, and the echoes of gunfire vanished into the haze. Now the courtyard was still. Garen rose, scanning for any more threats. The woman stood trembling, pistol dangling from her hand. Her violet eyes were wide and glassy. The children scrambled out from behind the barrier, pressing close to her legs. Garen slung his rifle over his shoulder and carefully approached. Blood stained the ground and the reek of death caught in his throat. But the raiders were motionless. "You're safe now," he said, his voice hoarse. She stared at him, chest heaving. The children looked at him with terrified fascination. For a moment no one moved or spoke. Then the boy asked, "Are you going to take us too?" His voice was so small Garen almost didn't catch the words. They struck like a physical blow. Garen knelt, meeting the boy's gaze. "No," he said softly. "I'm here to help." The child hesitated, searching Garen's face. Then the woman asked, "Why?" in a strained tone. Garen stood, glancing at the bodies of the raiders. "Because somebody has to," he said at last. They had no future here among the ashes. With a glance at her still raised pistol, he added, "Let's get out of this place." She did not reply immediately. Then she nodded, lowering the gun. Her hand shook so violently that it clattered against the pavement when she let it drop. She swallowed hard and gestured for the two children to follow. The boy pressed into her side, the little girl hiding her face in the folds of her mother's tattered cloak. Garen signaled for them to come along, leading them out of the courtyard. He had no firm plan, just the knowledge that staying would bring more danger. The colony was compromised, and raiders often returned in groups, better to find safer ground. They cut through the wreckage, the woman and children stepping gingerly to avoid shards of glass and twisted metal. Smoke clouded Garen's vision, stinging his eyes. Twice he thought he heard footsteps far off, but maybe it was just debris settling. They walked until they found a broken side street leading toward the colony's perimeter. Everywhere he looked, Garen saw signs of panic and flight. Discarded bags, personal items, scattered footprints that suggested people had tried to run. All gone or captured from the look of it. The children were silent. Occasionally the boy sniffled or the girl let out a tiny whimper, but they were otherwise eerily quiet. Eventually they cleared the settlement's edge. Beyond lay a barren landscape of rocky hills and dust-choked plains. The sun was dipping low behind the horizon, painting the sky a sullen orange. Garen glanced back. "We should find shelter," he said. The woman nodded but did not speak. She seemed unsteady, as though she might collapse from exhaustion. Garen wondered when she had last slept or eaten. He considered offering his hand to help steady her, but she remained rigid, clinging to her children. He led them along a path that once might have been a road, though any pavement was eroded into rubble. The wind was cold, picking up dust that stung their faces. After a time, they came across a derelict maintenance station built into the side of a rocky outcrop. The wide metal doors hung crooked, partially buried in sand. Garen tested them, wincing as the rusted hinges screamed in protest. Eventually, he pried them open wide enough to admit everyone. The space inside was dimly lit by flickering emergency lamps, the air stale with long disuse. He scanned for dangers, found none, and motioned the others inside. Once they were safely in, he sealed the door as best he could. The woman slumped against the wall, sliding down until she was almost sitting. The boy and girl rushed to her side. Garen rummaged through a row of rusted lockers, discovering a half-empty water canister, a few ration packs that looked far past their prime, and a first aid kit that might still contain something useful. He offered a ration bar to the woman. She eyed it warily, then took it. Breaking it into small pieces, she handed them to her children first. They ate with obvious hunger, though they looked to their mother for approval before taking each bite. Garen watched them in silence. It was only now, in the relative quiet, that he noticed how badly the woman was injured. A dried streak of blood ran from her temple. Dark bruises marked her arms, and her legs seemed twisted, though she tried to hide the limp. "You're hurt," he said, stepping closer. She stiffened. "I'll live." He held up the first aid kit, well aware that it was old, but hoping it still held bandages. "Let me help," he said. Her violet eyes flicked toward him, suspicious, uncertain. Then, with a soft exhale, she nodded. He cleaned the gash on her temple as best he could. The children watched him, wide-eyed, clinging to their mother. While he worked, Garen finally asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she answered, "Sarah." Her voice was low, rough with fatigue. He nodded. "Sarah?" "I'm Garen." He paused. "And your children?" "Ren," she murmured, touching the boy's shoulder. "La," resting a hand on the girl's head. The children peeked at him. Ren's face was smudged with dirt, and La's hair was matted with ash, but they looked as if they wanted to trust him. Garen tore open a bandage and gently applied it to Sarah's temple, noticing how she flinched at the contact. "Where are you from?" he asked quietly, hoping conversation might keep her awake. She gave a mirthless smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Nowhere that exists anymore," she said. "They cast me out. I was told I had no place among them." She didn't elaborate, and Garen decided not to push. By the time he was finished patching her up, Ren and Laurent were dozing against their mother's side, the stressful day having drained whatever energy they had left. Garen eased back, settling himself a few paces away, rifle across his lap, eyes on the door. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old metal structure. He breathed slowly, trying not to dwell on the images of the bodies, the ruined colony. But what returned to him most vividly was the moment he had heard Sarah saying that one sentence to the raider. "I can be a good wife to you, human." The hopelessness of that line lingered in his mind. When sleep finally tugged at him, he fought it off. Someone had to keep watch. If any raiders were nearby, they might track them. He let his gaze drift to Sarah, her children sleeping soundly against her. She looked exhausted, but there was still tension in her posture, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Garen wondered what had driven her to such desperation, how she had survived this long in a place torn apart by violence. He wondered why he cared. Morning brought a dull light through cracks in the maintenance station's roof. Garen shifted his stiff limbs, rotating his shoulder. The musty air was heavy, and his eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. The children woke first, blinking in the low light. Sarah stirred shortly after, wincing when she tried to stand, clearly favoring her left leg. "Does it hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice level. She gave a slight nod. "It's fine," she insisted, but Garen could see the dark stain of blood that had seeped through the fabric above her ankle. He lowered himself beside her, rummaging through the kit again. "Let me see," he said, an edge of command in his tone that surprised even him. She hesitated, then relented. He peeled back the makeshift bandage. The wound was shallow, but had reopened. Without speaking further, he cleaned it, applied salve from a battered tube, and wrapped it. She barely flinched, though her breathing was tight. The children watched intently. Finally, Wren ventured, "Are you a soldier?" Garen gave a half shrug. "Something like that." The boy's gaze was unwavering. "Did you fight raiders before?" Garen nodded once. Wren wrinkled his nose. "Did you win?" The question hung in the air, and Garen almost didn't answer. How could he explain that winning sometimes felt no different from losing, that every battlefield left behind ghosts? "Not always," he admitted. Wren seemed to consider this deeply, then reached into his small pocket, pulling out a dented metal badge. He offered it to Garen with a serious expression. "This is for luck," the boy said. Garen hesitated. The badge was tarnished, clearly old, probably worthless to anyone else, but to the child it was a treasure. "Thank you," he managed. Sarah observed this exchange without comment, though a trace of softness passed across her features. Then, as if reminding herself of something, she turned away, gathering her children. "We need to move," Garen said eventually. "There's a settlement to the north, heavily fortified. If we can get there, they might let us in." Sarah's eyes flicked to him. "Might?" He shrugged. "They'll take anyone who can pull their weight, guard duty, labor, something. It's safer than out here." She offered no argument, only a small nod. They set off again. The terrain outside was harsh, barren ground dotted with the wreckage of old vehicles, twisted metal beams, and deep cracks in the earth. Sometimes they scrambled over rocky outcrops, the children slowing them down but managing to keep pace. Garen glanced back often, scanning for any signs of raiders. Hours passed in a tense silence. No one spoke much. There was little to say. By mid-afternoon, they spotted a lone structure that appeared mostly intact, an old storage facility or watch post from some war years ago. They ventured inside for a brief rest, staying wary of collapsed beams and leftover explosives. Dust motes danced in the weak light. Garen searched for anything of use, discovering a few canisters of water that were half-silted but still drinkable when filtered, and some old ration packs with the packaging partially torn. He and Sarah split a bar, letting the children eat most of it. Lara wrinkled her nose at the taste. "It's bad," she whispered. "Keeps your belly full," Sarah replied gently. Garen examined Sarah's injuries again. Her face was paler than before, and he could tell she was trying to hide the pain. He insisted on changing her bandage. "You don't have to keep patching me up," she said, though she didn't pull away. "You don't have to keep walking on a wounded leg either," he retorted. She arched a brow but let him do it anyway. For a moment she studied his face, as if trying to discern what kind of man he was. He refused to meet her gaze, focusing on the makeshift bandage. The tension in the air was a subtle push and pull, both of them uncertain, bound only by the knowledge that alone they would be more vulnerable. When they pressed on, the wind had shifted. The sky overhead carried a bruised hint of rain. Garen felt a stirring in his gut, an instinct that something was off. He paused, raising a hand for silence. Then he heard it, the low hum of engines in the distance. He cursed under his breath, gesturing for Sarah and the children to get down. They ducked behind a cluster of rocks. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon, accompanied by the distinct roar of skiff thruster raiders or some other band of scavengers. Either way, it spelled trouble. "Take the kids and run," Garen hissed to Sarah, his rifle at the ready. Her eyes flared. "I'm not leaving you." "They'll catch us if we all run together," he replied sharply. "I can lead them away." She cut him off with a hard glare. "I said no, I will not leave you behind." Her defiance would have made him smile under different circumstances, but now it only frustrated him. The skiffs drew closer, and Garen knew they had seconds at best before being spotted. Shots rang out as the first skiff sped over a rocky ridge, carrying at least 4 raiders. Garen fired, striking the driver in the chest. The vehicle careened, smashing into a boulder before exploding into a fiery mass. The second skiff veered, forcing Garen to duck as bullets and plasma bolts tore through the air. He took cover behind a jagged rise of earth, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. Sarah, crouched behind rocks with Ren and Laura, managed to grab a pistol from a fallen raider. She fired at another skiff that was circling around. Flames and smoke erupted as she hit part of the engine, but the skiff didn't blow. More raiders jumped off, weapons drawn. They spread out, pinning Garen's position with suppressive fire. Bullets whined overhead, stirring up dust and rock chips. Garen saw them flank from the left. He swore, switching his rifle to automatic mode and unleashing a controlled burst. One raider dropped, but two more advanced. Then he heard Laura scream. His heart lurched as he spotted a raider heading straight for the children. Sarah burst from behind the rock, slamming into the man with enough force to knock him off his feet. She drove a blade into his throat. But she was exposed now, and another raider bashed her ribs with the butt of a rifle. She went down hard, gasping. Rage flooded Garen's veins. He broke cover, ignoring the sting of a near miss that grazed his upper arm. He fired twice, putting a bullet in the raider's skull before the man could strike Sarah again. Another raider shouted, swinging around to aim at Garen. Garen lunged, knife flashing, burying it under the raider's ribs. The man crumpled with a gurgle. Smoke from the burning skiff choked the air, stinging Garen's eyes. Suddenly, silence. The final raider had been shot by Sarah. Or perhaps he'd fled. Garen stood there, heart hammering, scanning for more threats. Finding none, he rushed to Sarah's side. She was on her knees, clutching her ribs, blood smeared on her fingers. "You're reckless," she hissed, her breath ragged. "So are you," he growled back, kneeling beside her. "Can you stand?" She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, trembling. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," she whispered, tears threatening. "You don't have to," he murmured, his arm sliding around her. "Just stay." For a moment neither moved. Then Sarah lifted her head, and he saw something raw in her eyes. She gripped his jacket, pulled him close, and kissed him hard. It was a clash of desperation and relief, a protest against the cruelty of the world around them. When they separated, Sarah's exhale was shaky. She looked over at her children, who peered out from behind a boulder. "Mama?" La whimpered. "I'm here," Sarah managed, reaching out. The children hurried over, tears glistening on their cheeks. Garen wrapped his free arm around them, and for one trembling second they huddled together in a battered circle. Then Sarah pulled away, jaw tightening. "We need to go," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Garen nodded. He made sure to pick up any spare ammunition from the fallen raiders, then helped Sarah to her feet. She winced, clutching her side, but she remained upright. They trudged onward, leaving the smoking wrecks behind. The sky was darker now, storm clouds threatening rain. The hours passed in painful silence, each step a small victory as they pressed toward the settlement that Garen had mentioned. He had never been there himself, but he had heard it was safer than most. High walls, armed patrols, enough stability that they might not turn away a wounded woman and two children. He and Sarah both limped, and Ren held Lore's hand, determined to keep her close. At last, as dusk settled, they topped a rise and saw it. A settlement ringed by metal barricades, watchtowers dotted around its perimeter. Floodlights moved in slow arcs, and the faint glow of interior fires hinted at life inside. Garen inhaled. It was rougher than he had hoped. The barricades looked pieced together from scrap, the watchtowers manned by tired guards. But it was a fortress by comparison to the open wasteland behind them. They approached cautiously. A guard on the outer towers shouted, demanding identification. Garen stepped forward, raising his hands to show no threat. "We need shelter," he called. "We've got kids here." The guard's suspicious gaze flicked over them, but eventually he must have recognized Garen's equipment or realized that turning away two frightened children was a bad look. With a mechanical groan, the gates slid open enough for them to enter. Inside, the settlement was as worn as Garen expected. The air smelled of cooking fires, oil, and sweat. Ragged tents and makeshift shacks lined the interior, people moving about with an air of grim determination. Some paused to stare at the newcomers. Sarah's posture was stiff, clearly uneasy with so many eyes on her. Ren pressed closer to her leg, and La did likewise. Garen took a step ahead, scanning the area for someone in charge. A woman wearing a reinforced jacket strode up, her hair cropped short, her eyes sharp. "Who are you?" she demanded, gaze bouncing between Garen, Sarah, and the children. Garen didn't back down from her scrutiny. "Just a soldier. I've been drifting. These three survived a raider attack." The woman crossed her arms. "We don't turn people away, but you'll have to pull your weight. We're low on supplies, and we don't feed anyone who won't work." Sarah lifted her chin. "I'll do whatever is needed," she said, voice steady. The woman studied her a moment, then nodded. "Fine. I'll find you a place to sleep." They were led through a narrow pathway of metal huts and sheds, the air thick with the murmur of voices and the occasional bark of a guard giving orders. Some children ran barefoot, playing among the discarded scraps. Despite the harshness, there was a faint sense of normalcy here. People survived, built routines, found ways to endure. Garen glanced at Sarah, noticing how she leaned slightly on the better side of her body, still trying not to show weakness. He longed to tell her she could rest now, but the settlement was still a new unknown. They were not yet safe from suspicion. At a small storage unit repurposed as a living space, the guard woman stopped. "This is open, not much, but the door locks, and you'll be out of the wind," she said. Inside, the walls were bare steel, a battered table in one corner and a small cot. It was cramped, but it was shelter. Sarah stepped in, scanning her surroundings as if expecting a trap. Garen stayed by the threshold, glancing around the settlement. Armed sentries patrolled above on catwalks, and in the distance, he heard the rumble of a generator. The guard woman looked him over. "If you're not injured, you can sign up for perimeter duty. You'll get credits for rations." She jerked a thumb at Sarah. "What skills does she have?" Garen hesitated, but Sarah answered for herself. "I can fight. I can cook." The guard gave a thin-lipped nod. "We'll see. The rules here are simple. No freeloading, no trouble. Understand?" "We do," Garen said. With a grunt, she stomped off. Ren and Lair crept inside, heads turning to take in their new surroundings. They both looked exhausted, grime and soot covering their small faces. Sarah sank onto the edge of the cot, letting her shoulders slump for the first time since Garen had met her. He closed the door behind him, though it didn't latch easily. He jerry-rigged it with a piece of scrap metal. The children curled up on the floor with a blanket that Sarah pulled from her bag. She softly stroked their hair, whispering in a language Garen didn't know, but the tone was soothing. A lullaby, perhaps. Garen sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, rifle resting across his knees. He said quietly, "You can sleep. I'll keep watch." Sarah nodded, her violet eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know how to stop waiting for things to go wrong," she admitted. "I know," he murmured. "But maybe they won't. Not this time." For a moment she looked at him as if trying to figure out what kind of dream he was offering. Then she lay beside her children, letting her eyelids droop shut. Soon the slow rhythm of their breathing filled the cramped space. Garen remained awake, mind churning. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he last felt the urge to remain somewhere, to not simply move on to the next battlefield. The idea of staying was both foreign and unexpectedly comforting. He gazed at Sarah's sleeping form, remembering the fierceness with which she fought, the desperation in her voice, that fleeting moment when she kissed him in the dust and smoke. He wondered what tomorrow might bring. Morning in the settlement was no less grim, but it had a sense of routine. Smoke rose from cooking fires, people lined up for water, guards rotated shifts on the walls. Garen found himself volunteering for perimeter duty by midday, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon from a battered watchtower. He saw the fields of rubble stretching to the south, jagged outcroppings that raiders could use as cover. A man next to him, chewing something that smelled of raw spice, grunted in greeting. Garen gave a curt nod. No one seemed interested in small talk. Survival was enough. Below, he occasionally caught glimpses of Sarah and the children. She was sorting supplies in a makeshift canteen area, her brow furrowed, a bandage still wrapped around her ribs. Ren and Lara sat quietly, nibbling on ration bars. Ren had found a scrap of wood and was trying to carve it with a dull knife, emulating older men who fashioned handles or small toys. Lara watched him, occasionally giving input in a hushed voice. Garen felt an odd warmth spread through him at the sight. It was such a normal scene, parents working, children playing, even if everything around them was harsh metal and half-collapsed structures. That evening, after his shift ended, Garen returned to the storage unit. Sarah had managed to make a watery stew using the settlement's limited rations and some leftover vegetables that were on the brink of spoiling. The four of them sat around the small table. Lara wrinkled her nose at the taste but ate anyway, while Ren seemed too hungry to complain. Sarah ate slowly, as if half expecting the food to be snatched away. Garen tried a spoonful. Bland, but it was nourishment. A sense of calm settled over them, an almost domestic quiet. For a moment he imagined what it might be like to stay like this indefinitely. The children soon drifted off to sleep, Ren on the cot, Lara curled up against him. Sarah stood by the doorway, arms crossed. She stared out into the settlement's winding paths lit by a scattering of dim lights. Garen joined her, leaning against the threshold, the night air cool on his face. She said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, "I never imagined I would end up here, like this." He watched her profile. "You mean out in the wasteland or in a strange settlement with someone like me?" She gave a huffed half-laugh. "Both, I suppose." He hesitated, not wanting to pry, but a question burned in his mind. "Why did your people cast you out?" She closed her eyes, sighing. "My husband was a respected warrior. When he died, they told me to take another mate or leave. I refused. I wouldn't let them assign me like some object, so they erased me." Her voice carried a hurt that had long since numbed. "My children, they said I was selfish for denying them a father, that a lone woman was incomplete. I believed them for a time. That was the only way I survived. I repeated what they wanted to hear. My children are well behaved. I can be a good wife. Anything to buy time for my family." Her lips trembled, but she quickly set her jaw. Garen understood better now why she had uttered those words in front of the raiders. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him with unguarded vulnerability for the first time. "Don't be. I did what I had to do." She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his. In that subtle contact, Garen felt the slightest shift in the air between them. He raised a hand, hesitating, then lightly rested his palm on her arm. She didn't pull away. They stood like that for a while, neither speaking. There was comfort in the closeness, in knowing that for this moment at least they weren't alone in the wasteland. Finally he murmured, "You don't have to do this all yourself anymore." She let out a soft sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You're the first person who's ever said that," she admitted, turning so that their faces were inches apart. Her breath caught, and Garen leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. The faint flicker of the settlement's lights cast shadows on her cheek. When their lips met, it was a gentler kiss than before, absent the desperate edge of battle. This one was tender, exploring a space they hadn't been sure was allowed. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, and he pulled her closer. The distant noise of the settlement faded into a soft hum. For a few heartbeats, they let themselves believe that tomorrow might be better, that they had found a place to belong. The days that followed found them settling into a tentative routine. Garen pulled more shifts on the perimeter, proving himself a capable marksman and steady watchman. Sarah helped with the settlement's canteen and sometimes stood guard at the gates. The children played or helped carry water. They still flinched at loud noises, but they began to smile more often, especially when Garen returned from his duties with any sort of treat. A slightly bruised fruit, an extra piece of bread. Sarah's injuries healed slowly, the bruises on her arms fading to yellow, her limp less pronounced. Every so often they caught whispers and glances from others in the settlement. Some were wary of Sarah's origins, her alien features, or simply suspicious of newcomers. But the settlement's policy was pragmatic. If you could work and not cause trouble, you were welcome. Still, Garen noticed the way she kept her head down, never fully at ease. He tried to reassure her that she no longer needed to run, but the scars in her mind ran deep. One evening, after he finished a double shift on the watchtower, he found Sarah beneath a low canopy near the settlement's center. The children played nearby, chasing each other around crates, laughing for the first time in who knew how long. She stood alone, leaning on a wooden post. As he approached, he saw a hint of a smile on her lips as she watched Wren and Laura. "They look so happy," Garen said. Sarah nodded, blinking as if surprised he was there. "Yes," she said softly. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see that again." He joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, a small gesture of trust. "How about you?" he asked. "Do you think you can be happy here?" She hesitated. "I don't know how to stop waiting for something terrible to happen." "That might never go away," he admitted. "But maybe it won't be as strong over time." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I hope so." The children's laughter drifted to them, and Garen felt a warmth in his chest he couldn't recall experiencing before. It was the warmth of belonging somewhere, with someone. Sometimes at night, especially when the wind howled against the settlement's scrap walls, Garen would awaken to find Sarah staring out a small makeshift window, fear or worry etched on her face. He would join her, pressing a reassuring hand to her back. She'd close her eyes for a moment, letting him stand there, saying nothing. On one such night, she looked at him and spoke in a trembling whisper. "I've lost everything before. I can't let that happen again." He cupped her cheek, brushing back a stray strand of black hair. "Then we won't let it happen," he promised. Not entirely sure how he would keep that vow, but certain he wanted to try. Word spread among the settlement that more raiders had been spotted in the region, skiffs patrolling nearby routes. The tension was palpable. People doubled watch shifts, fortified barricades. Garen found himself instructing younger guards on basic marksmanship. Despite his reluctance to get involved in another large conflict, he recognized that if the settlement fell, Sarah and the children would have nowhere left to go. Protecting the settlement became protecting his family, though the realization made him uneasy, as if acknowledging that he had something precious to lose. On the third week after they arrived, a small raider scouting party tested the settlement's defenses. Shots rang out in the late afternoon, setting everyone on edge. Garen rushed to the southern gate, rifle in hand, and glimpsed a handful of raiders on skiffs. They took a few potshots at the walls, but ultimately retreated. A warning, perhaps. Nerves ran high, but the settlement leadership decided they had enough manpower to hold off a larger attack, at least for a while. That night, Garen found Sarah sitting on the cot they shared, her knees drawn up to her chest. The children were sleeping on blankets at the other end of the unit. He could sense the tension in the way she pressed her lips together. "They might come here," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied, leaning his rifle against the wall. "And we'll be ready." She met his eyes. "No matter what?" He sank down beside her, taking her hand. "No matter what," he echoed, the promise heavy with all the implications of living in a violent world. She squeezed his hand in return. In the days that followed, more refugees trickled into the settlement, some wounded, carrying stories of other colonies burned to the ground. Wren and Lara stared at them with wide eyes, remembering the horror they themselves had fled. Sometimes Lara clung to Sarah, trembling as old memories resurfaced. Garen tried to distract them, teaching Wren how to hold a practice rifle or carve small wooden figures. Though these were moments of relative peace, the looming threat of raiders gnawed at them all. One late afternoon, Garen came back from a patrol shift to find Sarah outside the makeshift canteen. She had a bruise forming on her left cheek, and her posture was rigid with anger. He instantly went to her side, fists clenching. "What happened?" Her eyes flashed. "One of the men here tried to provoke me, called me a cast-out alien, said I was probably working with raiders." She paused, breath shaking. "I think he was just drunk, but he grabbed me. I told him not to touch me." Garen's jaw tightened. "Who was it?" She put a hand on his chest, a silent plea for restraint. "He's gone now. A guard took him to the leader for a warning." She forced a shaky smile. "I don't need you to fight all my battles." He nodded slowly, though it took effort to calm the anger in his veins. "I know," he murmured, brushing a thumb across the swelling bruise. "Still, I hate seeing you hurt." She sighed, leaning into him. "This place may not be perfect," she said, "but it's better than out there. We have a chance." He kissed her temple gently, mindful of the bruise. "Yes, a chance is more than we had before." She gave him a grateful look, and for a moment they let the anger and fear subside. More days passed. Despite occasional tensions, the settlement slowly came to accept Sarah's presence. Partly thanks to her consistent work and the quiet respect Garen commanded, Ren and Lara began to make friends with the local children. Sarah's limp lessened. Garen's nightmares, usually triggered by memories of past battles, faded a little. He found himself imagining the future, something he never used to do. Perhaps a modest life behind these walls, perhaps the possibility of building a home. One evening the sky threatened rain, a rare enough occurrence that it stirred excitement among the settlers. People dragged out barrels to collect water, and the air smelled of impending moisture rather than dust. Garen and Sarah sat near a small fire in a sheltered nook, the children curled up on a blanket behind them. He could see the silhouettes of watchtowers overhead, the glow of industrial lights illuminating sheets of corrugated metal. Sarah spoke in a hushed tone, telling him about her husband, how he had died in a skirmish, how her society insisted she remarry, and how she refused. Garen listened, heart heavy at the thought of her isolation. She finished with a rueful laugh. "In the end, all I had left were these 2 children and some worthless promise that I'd be safe if I submitted. But I couldn't." Garen reached out, lacing his fingers with hers. "You shouldn't have to." She looked at him, her violet eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "What about you?" she asked. "What made you a wanderer?" He swallowed, memories prickling. "I was a soldier in a corporate war off-world," he admitted. "My unit was ordered to hold a settlement. We failed. Civilians died. I left. Couldn't stand the guilt, kept drifting to new places, new battles, hoping maybe I could save someone else, or maybe I was just running from the ghosts." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "But you saved me," she said quietly, emotion wavering in her voice. He let out a breath, relieved yet burdened by the thought. "I guess I did." A light rain began pattering on the metal above them. The children stirred, half asleep, but lulled by the gentle sound of water. Sarah tilted her head up, eyes closing. A single drop slid down her cheek, glistening in the firelight. Garen felt his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. He lifted his free hand to brush away the raindrop, and, in that moment, the tension of the world seemed to pause. He kissed her, softly at first. She responded with equal tenderness, and they forgot briefly about the settlement, the raiders, the endless rubble. The rain grew heavier, a mild downpour that rinsed away dust and soot from the battered rooftops. Lara mumbled in her sleep, rolling closer to Ren under the blanket, the quiet hush of water lulling them. When they finally broke apart, Sarah rested her head on Garen's shoulder, their arms wrapped around each other in silence. They listened to the rain, and it sounded like a lullaby of hope. The next morning, the settlement awoke to puddles in the streets, water trickling off rooftops. People gathered in small groups, collecting what they could. Garen helped fill barrels and containers, feeling surprisingly light-hearted. In the corner of his eye, he watched Sarah help direct children away from slippery metal sheets. The conversation about the future weighed on his mind, but the weight had turned from dread into something more like anticipation. That afternoon, the settlement's leader called a brief meeting of newcomers. Garen and Sarah were among those summoned. The leader, an older woman with streaks of gray in her hair, stood on a makeshift platform. She addressed the group, explaining that more raids were likely, that they needed everyone to cooperate, to do patrols or help with maintenance. When it was over, the crowd dispersed. Sarah glanced at Garen. "Seems they're worried about a bigger attack." He nodded. "We'll do our part." And so they did. Garen took additional shifts, training some of the young men to handle rifles properly. Sarah joined a rotating watch schedule, her quick reflexes helpful in spotting movement outside the walls. Ren became known for practicing with a wooden sword, dreaming of being a soldier like Garen. and Lara timidly followed him around, though she clearly preferred quieter games. Nights blended into days, and the sense of community, though rough, began to anchor them. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Garen and Sarah sat on the edge of the cot, talking in hushed voices. He'd removed his boots and was flexing his sore feet, and she was leaning back against him, letting him massage her bruised shoulder. She glanced down at his hand, calloused from years of battle, and asked, "When all this is done, if it ever ends, would you want to keep moving?" His hand paused. He breathed in. "I'm tired of wandering," he admitted. "I never thought I'd say that, but I think I'd stay if you wanted me to." She closed her eyes, exhaling softly. "I do," she whispered, turning to look at him. "I want you to stay, not just for protection, but because—" Her words trailed off, but the meaning hung there, as clear as the warm flush on her cheek. They kissed, a gentle affirmation of the closeness that had grown between them, of all the unspoken promises they were still learning to put into words. The night outside was calm, no gunshots, no raider engines. Just the quiet hum of the settlement's generator and the distant murmur of people drifting to sleep. Days stretched into weeks. The large-scale attack never came, or else the raiders found another target. The settlement reinforced its outer walls, and occasional trade caravans passed through, exchanging scarce supplies. Garen continued to serve as a lookout, and Sarah contributed to cooking and watch shifts. Slowly, life took on something resembling stability. The children laughed more often. Ren even made a friend with another boy who liked to carve wooden toys. Lara developed a habit of braiding Sarah's hair, and sometimes tried to do the same for Garen, which he grumbled about but secretly found endearing. He was far from perfect. Bickering broke out in the settlement over ration allotments. Sometimes fights nearly escalated to violence, but generally the place held together. Garen and Sarah spent quiet evenings with the children, and though the space was cramped, it felt more like a home than either of them had known in a long time. He became used to the sound of Lara's giggles and Ren's questions about tactics and warfare. Sometimes Ren would say, "When I'm older, I'll fight the raiders like you," and Garen would feel a knot of worry in his chest, not wanting the boy to face the darkness of war. But he would just ruffle the child's hair and tell him to keep practicing with his wooden sword. One night, Sarah was sitting outside their storage unit, gazing at the sky. The children had already gone to bed. Garen joined her, lowering himself beside her on an overturned crate. You're thinking again," he teased gently. She let out a soft laugh. "I can't help it." He nudged her shoulder. "What about?" She lifted her gaze to the faint stars visible through the settlement's patchwork overhead. "I finally feel safe, but I don't know how to handle it." Garen smiled ruefully. "We can figure it out together." She turned to him, her eyes shining with the same fierce determination that had made her stand up to raiders. "I don't need you to save me," she said, voice quiet. "But I want you with me, do you understand?" He reached up, thumb brushing her cheek. "I think I do." She tilted her face into his hand and they leaned in, a shared breath passing between them. His other arm wrapped around her waist and they sat that way, pressed close, hearts beating in tandem. The settlement gate lights flickered. Someone yelled goodnight from a distant corner. The hush of evening descended and they lingered outside until the air turned chill. Then they rose, hand in hand, and retreated inside to where the children lay sleeping, drifting away into dreams of a tomorrow less haunted by violence. And so time went on. Though the world remained uncertain and the threat of raiders persisted, they had found a place to call their own, at least for now. In the battered settlement, with its walls of welded scrap and watchtowers, Garen and Sarah forged a new life alongside Ren and Lara. Each day brought challenges, shortages of food, tension with other settlers, the need to remain vigilant, but also moments of shared laughter, of quiet bonding that made the hardships bearable. They had arrived together as broken souls, a desperate widow who had been cast out, her two frightened children, and a soldier tired of fighting ghosts. Under the settlement's patchy glow, they formed something resembling a family. At night, as Garen set his rifle aside and lay down next to Sarah, listening to the soft breathing of Ren and Laura, he wondered if this was what he'd been looking for all along. He remembered that first day, hearing her plea to the radar. Words that had sounded so hollow and yet had saved her life. Now, with Sarah drifting to sleep against his shoulder, he knew that neither of them needed to say such things anymore. They had chosen each other freely, bound by circumstance, but staying by choice. He closed his eyes, breathing in the faint, reassuring scent of her hair and the dust that clung to everything in this rugged outpost. Outside, the wind rattled a loose metal panel, but he felt no urge to rise and wander off into the night. Instead, he wrapped an arm around Sarah, letting the knowledge of their small, precious haven lull him into rest. And if the next day brought another threat, or the day after that, they would face it together, because for all the brokenness in the world beyond these walls, they had found a reason to remain. "My children are well behaved. I can be a good wife to you, human." The sentence still echoed in Garen's memory, but now it was no longer a desperate plea to a monster. Now it was just a reminder of how far they'd come, how they had managed to keep each other alive, and how every tomorrow could be a day where they chose, freely, to stand side by side. The flickering lamp in the corner cast shadows that curved against the steel walls, and in that quiet, fragile space they had finally found what they needed most, a place to belong and someone to share it with.